The rain drummed against my windshield like skeletal fingers, tapping out some forgotten rhythm. 3 in the morning on Highway 49, and I was the only fool driving through the mountains in weather like this. My shift at the chemical plant had run long again. Overtime pay wasn't worth much if you ended up wrapped around a pine tree. But rent doesn't pay itself. The wipers squeaked across the glass, their dying motor adding to the symphony of mechanical complaints my 12-year-old Honda had been composing for months. I squinted through the murk, trying to follow the yellow lines that seemed to dance and blur in the headlight beams. Coffee would have helped, but the vending machine at work had eaten my last $2 without delivering anything more substantial than a grinding noise and a cryptic error message. That's when I saw her dotted first. She was just a pale smudge. Against the darkness, standing on the shoulder, maybe 50 yards ahead. My foot found the brake instinctively, the car sliding slightly on the wet asphalt before the tires caught hold. As I got closer, details emerged from the gloom like a photograph. Developing in slow motion, she was young, maybe mid-20s, with long dark hair plastered to her head by the rain. Her white dress, and who wears a white dress on a night like this, clung to her thin frame, translucent in places where the water had soaked through. She stood perfectly still, arms at her sides, facing the road with an expression I couldn't quite read from inside the car. I pulled over, hazard lights clicking on automatically. The smart thing would have been to call the police, let them handle whatever situation this obviously was. But something about her stillness, her complete lack of self-preservation in the face of hypothermia, made me roll down the passenger window instead. "Hey," I called over the sound of rain hammering on my roof. "You okay out there?" She turned toward me, and that's when I got my first good look at her face. Pretty in a classical sort of way, with sharp cheekbones and full lips. But it was her eyes that made my stomach clench. They were too dark, too deep, like looking into wells that had never seen sunlight. And they held a kind of sadness that seemed to reach right through the car window and grab hold of something vital in my chest. "My car broke down," she said, her voice somehow carrying clearly over the storm. "About a mile back. Could you help?" Me? Every instinct I'd developed in 32 years of life was screaming warnings. People don't stand in thunderstorms wearing evening gowns. People don't look that composed after walking a mile in freezing rain. People definitely don't have voices that carry, like that in weather that should drown out everything except the thunder. But she was soaked through and shivering. At least, I thought she was shivering. The movement was so slight it might have been my imagination, or the way the headlights played tricks with the rain. "Get in," I heard myself saying. "I'll drive you to town. There's a 24-hour tow service near the highway patrol station." She moved around to the passenger side with an odd gliding step that didn't quite match the rhythm of normal walking. When she opened the door, the dome light revealed details I'd missed from a distance. Her dress wasn't just white, it was a wedding dress, complete with intricate lacework and a train that had been torn and muddied. But there was no mud on her bare feet, despite the mile she claimed to have walked. "Thank you," she said, settling into the passenger seat with careful precision. "I didn't think anyone would come." The temperature in the car dropped about 10 degrees the moment she closed the door. I reached for the heater controls, but she caught my wrist with fingers that felt like ice cubes wrapped in silk. "Don't," she said softly. "I prefer the cold." Her touch sent electric jolts up my arm, but not the good kind. The kind that made every hair on my body stand at attention and my lizard brain start screaming about predators and prey. And the very real possibility that I was about to become the latter. "So," I said, pulling back onto the road and trying to keep my voice steady, "wedding night didn't go as planned?" She was quiet for so long, I thought she hadn't heard me. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed, become softer somehow, more distant. "No," she said. "It didn't go as planned at all." I glanced over at her profile, illuminated by the green glow of the dashboard. She was staring straight ahead, her hands folded in her lap like a schoolgirl waiting for the teacher to call on her. But there was something wrong with the way she sat, too still, too perfectly composed, like she was concentrating very hard on appearing normal. "What happened?" I asked, because sometimes the best way to deal with weird situations is to lean into them. "Car trouble. Or did you have a fight with your husband?" "Husband?" She turned to look at me, and I immediately regretted asking. Her eyes reflected the dashboard light like an animal's, throwing back pale green fire. There was no husband. There was never going to be a husband. The way she said it made my mouth go dry. There was a finality to it, a weight that suggested this wasn't just a case of cold feet or family drama. This was something else entirely, something that had left her standing in a thunderstorm, wearing a wedding dress and looking like she'd stepped out of a Gothic novel. "I'm sorry," I said, "because what else do you say to that? Are you?" She tilted her head, studying me with the intensity of a scientist examining a particularly interesting specimen. "Sorry enough to help me? I am helping you. I'm driving you to town, remember? That's not the kind of help I need." The car hit a pothole and bounced, jarring me back to reality. We were still on Highway 49, still heading toward the lights of Millbrook. Still just two people in a car on a rainy night. Normal, perfectly normal. Except for the fact that I couldn't see her breath, despite the cold. Except for the way she seemed to know exactly where we were going without asking for directions. Except for the growing certainty that I had just made the kind of mistake that people in horror movies make, right before everything goes terribly, catastrophically wrong. The call came in at 7:43 on a Tuesday morning, just as I was contemplating whether my third cup of coffee would kill me or keep me functional for another few hours. Dispatch crackled through the radio with a kind of flat professionalism. That meant someone's day was about to get significantly worse. "Unit 12, we've got an abandoned vehicle on Highway 49, mile marker 37. Registered owner is Marcus Holloway, reported missing by his supervisor at Millbrook Chemical. Vehicle appears to have struck a tree." I set my coffee down and reached for my jacket. Highway 49 was my territory, a stretch of mountain road that seemed to collect accidents and mysteries in equal measure. In my 15 years with the sheriff's department, I'd pulled more bodies out of those trees than I cared to count, usually drunk drivers who'd misjudged a curve or fallen asleep at the wheel. But something about this one felt different from the moment I arrived at the scene. The Honda Civic was wrapped around the trunk of a massive pine tree, like it had been gift-wrapped by someone with a particularly violent sense of humor. The front end was completely demolished, the hood folded back, on itself like an accordion. Steam still rose from the radiator, even though the morning air was crisp enough to make my breath visible. But there was no body. Officer Janet Kowalski was already there, taking photographs and measurements. She looked up as I approached, her expression troubled. "No sign of the driver," she said without preamble. "No blood, no indication he was thrown from the vehicle. It's like he just vanished." I walked around the car, noting the deployment of the airbag, the spider web of cracks across the windshield, the way the driver's door hung open at an unnatural angle. The impact had been severe enough to total the vehicle, but not severe enough to completely destroy the passenger compartment. "Passenger seat?" I asked. "That's the weird part." Janet pointed to the interior. "Look at the upholstery." I leaned in through the open door and immediately saw what she meant. The driver's seat showed all the signs of impact-torn fabric, vent, frame, blood on the headrest where Marcus Holloway's head had presumably made contact. But the passenger seat was soaked through, as if someone had dumped several gallons of water on it. The fabric was so saturated that water was still dripping onto the floor mat. "Any rain last night?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Bone. Dry for the past week. And look at this." She led me to the passenger side and pointed to the ground. No footprints, no drag marks, nothing to suggest anyone got out of this side of the car. I examined the saturated seat more closely. The water had no smell, no color, nothing to suggest it was anything other than pure H2O. But the amount was impossible. You'd need a fire hose to create that level of saturation, and there was no corresponding dampness anywhere else in the vehicle. What about the driver? I asked. Any theories on where Marcus Holloway went? That's the million-dollar question. I called his supervisor, guy named Pete Morrison. Says Marcus left work at 3 a.m., same as always. Should have been home by 3:30. His roommate didn't realize he was missing until Morrison called looking for him this morning. I pulled out my notebook and started sketching the scene, trying to make sense of the physical evidence. Single vehicle accident, driver vanished, passenger seat inexplicably soaked. In 15 years of police work, I'd learned that when the evidence didn't make sense, it usually meant you weren't asking the right questions. Any surveillance cameras on this stretch of road? You're kidding, right? This is the middle of nowhere. Closest traffic cam is 15 miles toward town. I walked back to the front of the vehicle, studying the impact pattern. The car had hit the tree dead on, no signs of swerving or attempting to brake. Either Marcus had fallen asleep at the wheel, or something had caused him to lose control completely. "Janet, call the lab. I want this passenger seat analyzed for everything water content, mineral composition, anything that might tell us where this water came from." "You think the passenger seat is important?" "I think everything about this scene is important until we figure out what happened to Marcus Holloway." As she walked back to her patrol car to make the call, I continued my examination of the Honda. The glove compartment had popped open during the impact, spilling registration papers and a few audio CDs onto the floor. Nothing unusual. The back seat was empty except for a work uniform and what looked like a gym bag. But when I opened the trunk, I found something that made my stomach clench. A wedding dress. It was pristine white, the kind of expensive gown that cost more than most people made in a month. Intricate lacework, pearl buttons, a train that had been carefully folded to fit in the trunk space. But that wasn't the disturbing part. The disturbing part was that it was soaking wet, not damp, not moist soaking wet, as if it had been pulled from a washing machine. Water had pooled in the bottom of the trunk, and the fabric was so saturated. It felt heavy in my hands. Like the passenger seat, it had no smell, no indication of how it had gotten so thoroughly drenched. "Janet," I called, "you need to see this." She jogged back over, took one look at the dress, and let out a low whistle. "Okay, that's officially weird. Why would a single guy be driving around with a wedding dress in his trunk? More importantly, why would it be soaking wet when everything else in the car is bone dry?" I lifted the dress carefully, noting the quality of the construction. The hand-sewn beadwork that suggested serious money had been spent on it. There were no tags, no labels, nothing to indicate where it had been purchased or who it might belong. We need to expand the search," I said. "Full forensics team, cadaver dogs, the works. And I want to talk to everyone who knew Marcus Holloway. There's something about this accident that doesn't add up." As if summoned by my words, my radio crackled to life. Dispatch again, this time with the kind of tension in her voice that made experienced cops pay attention. "All units, be advised. We have a report of a missing person that may be connected to the Highway 49 incident. Female, mid-20s, disappeared from her home in Millbrook sometime last night. Last seen wearing a white wedding dress." I looked down at the soaked gown in my hands and back at Janet's pale face. "Get me that address," I said, "and call the state police." This just became a lot more complicated. The call from Detective Brooks came at the worst possible time, right in the middle of my Tuesday morning folklore seminar, just as I was explaining to 23 increasingly skeptical undergraduates why local legends matter in understanding cultural psychology. The irony wasn't lost on me when I listened to her describe the Highway 49 incident. "Professor Vasquez, this is Detective Riley Brooks with the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department. I understand you've done research on local folklore, particularly stories connected to Highway 49? I stepped outside the classroom, gesturing for my students to continue their discussion of urban legends and their sociological implications. If only they knew how relevant their assignment was about to become. That's correct. I've been documenting regional folklore for about 5 years now. Why do you ask? We've got a situation that might benefit from your expertise. Could you meet me at the station this afternoon?" 3 hours later, I sat in a conference room that smelled of burnt coffee and desperation, listening to Detective Brooks describe the most textbook case of supernatural manifestation I'd encountered in my academic career. The missing driver, the soaked wedding dress, the mysterious disappearance, every detail fit a pattern I'd been tracking for years. "Detective," I said carefully, "before I share what I know, I need to ask, are you prepared to consider explanations that might fall outside conventional police work?" She looked tired, the kind of exhaustion that comes from trying to force inexplicable evidence into logical frameworks. "At this point, Professor, I'm prepared to consider explanations involving little green men if they help me find Marcus Holloway." I opened my laptop and pulled up the file I'd been building since I first heard about the Highway 49 disappearances. 7 missing persons over the past 35 years, all on the same stretch of road, all under remarkably similar circumstances. "Tell me," I said, "have you found any record of other disappearances on that particular section of highway?" "A few. Nothing that seemed connected until now." "What if I told you there's been a pattern of disappearances every 7 years, going back to 1989? Always single drivers, always at night, always during storms or periods of reduced visibility, and always involving reports of a woman in white." "Detective." Brooks leaned forward, her professional skepticism warring with the need to find answers. "Woman in white?" "A figure from folklore that appears in cultures around the world. Usually the spirit of a woman who died tragically, often on her wedding day, who appears to travelers and asks for help. In most versions of the story, helping her leads to ... complications." I clicked through my research files, showing her newspaper, clippings, police reports, interview transcripts I'd collected over years of investigation. The pattern was undeniable once you knew how to look for it. 1989. David Chun, 28, chemical plant worker. Car found wrapped around a tree. Driver missing. Witnesses reported seeing a woman in white on the road that night. 1996. Robert Martinez, 35, long-haul trucker. Same stretch of road, same circumstances. His logbook mentioned picking up a female hitchhiker in a white dress. 2003. James Patterson, 26, nurse driving home from a night shift. Security camera at a gas station 10 miles away caught him with a passenger young woman, dark hair, white clothing. 2010. Kevin Walsh, 31, factory supervisor. His cell phone was found in his crashed vehicle with a voice message he'd left for his brother. You can hear a woman's voice in the background, asking for help. 2017. Michael Torres, 29, construction worker. Again, same road, same pattern. His girlfriend reported he'd called her, said he was giving a ride to someone whose car had broken down. And now, 2024. Marcus Holloway. Detective Brooks studied the timeline, her expression growing more troubled with each entry. Every 7 years, like clockwork. Within a few days, yes. Always in October, always on nights when visibility is poor. And there's something else. I pulled up a scanned document from the Millbrook Historical Society. In 1982, there was a fatal accident on that same stretch of road. A young woman named Victoria Rain was killed when her car went off the road during a thunderstorm. Let me guess, she was wearing a wedding dress. She was driving to her rehearsal dinner. The wedding was supposed to be the next day. According to the police report, she'd been upset about something, left her fiance's house in a hurry during an argument. She was found 3 days later at the bottom of a ravine, still wearing her wedding gown. I showed her the photograph from the newspaper archive. Victoria Rain had been beautiful in a classical way, sharp cheekbones, full lips, long dark hair. But it was her eyes that made Detective Brooks go pale. Even in the grainy black and white newspaper photo, they held a depth that seemed to reach out from the page. The first disappearance happened exactly 7 years after her death, I continued. Every subsequent disappearance has followed the same pattern. 7-year cycles, always on the anniversary of her accident, always involving someone who stops to help a woman in white. You're telling me we're dealing with a ghost. I'm telling you we're dealing with something that fits the folkloric pattern of what's called a vengeful spirit or revenant. An entity that can't rest because of unfinished business or traumatic death. In Victoria's case, she died alone on what should have been one of the happiest nights of her life. Detective Brooks was quiet for a long moment, staring at the evidence spread across the table. Assuming for the sake of argument that you're right, what happens to the people who help her? That's where the folklore gets unclear. Some versions suggest they're taken to whatever realm the spirit inhabits. Others imply they become part of the manifestation, trapped in an endless cycle of seeking help they can never receive. And some versions? I hesitated, knowing how this would sound to a rational law enforcement officer. Some versions suggest that the spirit is looking for a replacement, someone to take her place so she can finally rest. A replacement for what? For the eternal repetition of her trauma. Think about it. She died alone, on her way to celebrate love and commitment. Betrayed by someone she trusted. Now she appears to solitary travelers, asks for their help, and they disappear. It's like she's replaying the night of her death over and over, except now she's the one in control. Detective Brooks rubbed her temples. This is insane. You realize how this sounds. I realize how it sounds. But consider the alternative explanations. 7 different people, across 35 years, all vanish under identical circumstances on the same stretch of road. All their vehicles are found with evidence of a mysterious passenger who left behind impossible amounts of water. No bodies are ever found. No logical explanation emerges. The water. What's your theory about that? Water is often associated with spiritual manifestations. It's a conductor, a medium between worlds. In folklore, spirits often appear accompanied by water tears, rain, mist. The fact that Victoria died during a rainstorm might be significant. I closed my laptop and looked directly at her. Detective, I know this challenges everything you've been trained to believe about how the world works. But I've been studying this phenomenon for 5 years, and I'm convinced we're dealing with something that operates outside the normal rules of physics and logic. So what do you suggest we do? Hold a seance? I suggest we try to understand what Victoria Rain wants and why she's trapped in this cycle. And I suggest we accept the possibility that Marcus Holloway isn't just missing. He might be part of something that's been going on for decades. Detective Brooks gathered up the files, her expression thoughtful, despite her obvious skepticism. I'll need copies of all your research. And I want to visit the site where Victoria died. There might be someone else you should talk to first. Someone who encountered the woman in white and lived to tell about it. Who? Father Mitchell at St. Andrew's Parish. He's been the priest there for over 40 years. According to my notes, he was one of the first responders to Victoria's accident in 1982. And more importantly, he had his own encounter with her 7 years later. A knock came at my rectory door just as the evening bells finished calling the faithful to vespers. In 43 years of ministry, I'd learned to recognize the sound of desperation, the urgent rhythm that meant someone needed more than pastoral comfort. They needed salvation from something that couldn't be explained in any seminary textbook. Detective Brooks stood on my doorstep with a young woman I recognized as Professor Vasquez from the college. Their faces carried the particular strain that comes from wrestling with evidence that challenges the foundations of rational thought. "Father Mitchell," Detective Brooks said, "we need to talk to you about Victoria Rain." I'd been expecting this conversation for 7 years. "Come in," I said, stepping aside to let them enter the modest sitting room where I'd counseled countless parishioners through the darkness of doubt and loss. "I assume this is about the disappearance on Highway 49. Professor Vasquez says you encountered the woman in white yourself. In 1989, I poured 3 cups of tea with hands that still trembled slightly when I thought about that night. 35 years had passed, but some memories remain as sharp as broken glass, cutting deeper each time you examine them. I was much younger then, I began, settling into my worn leather chair, newly assigned to St. Andrew's, full of certainty about the nature of good and evil, convinced that faith could overcome any darkness. I was wrong about many things. What happened that night? I stared into my tea, seeing not the amber liquid, but the rain-slicked highway and the pale figure that had changed everything I thought I knew about the world. October 15th, 1989. I was driving back from the hospital in Millbrook. Mrs. Patterson had been dying, and her family wanted last rites. It was nearly midnight, raining so hard I could barely see the road. That's when I saw her standing on the shoulder. Victoria. At the time, I thought she was just a young woman in trouble. She was wearing a wedding dress, soaked through, looking lost and frightened. When I stopped to help, she told me her car had broken down, asked if I could drive her to town. Professor Vasquez leaned forward. "You gave her a ride?" "I did." And that's when I realized something was terribly wrong. The temperature in my car dropped so dramatically that my breath misted. Her clothes were dripping wet, but no water fell on my seats. And when she spoke, I paused, remembering the way. Her voice had seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. What did she say? She told me about the accident, about driving to her rehearsal dinner, fighting with her fiancé Richard about his gambling debts and the money that had gone missing from their joint account. She'd discovered he'd been stealing from her family's business to pay off loan sharks. The wedding was supposed to be the next day, but she'd decided to call it off. She told you all this? Not at first. It came out gradually, like a confession. She said she was angry, heartbroken, that she'd driven too fast in the rain because she couldn't bear the thought of facing everyone, of admitting her perfect romance was built on lies. I set down my tea with a shaking hand. That's when I understood what I was dealing with. Victoria Rain had been dead for 7 years. I was sitting next to a ghost. What did you do? What any priest would do when confronted with the supernatural. I tried to help her find peace. I asked what she needed, what was keeping her bound to this world. And she said she needed someone to understand, someone to know the truth about what had happened, about why she died alone and betrayed. But more than that, she needed ... I struggled to find the right words. She needed someone to take her place. Detective Brooks went very still. Take her. Place how? The cycle of appearing, asking for help, taking those who show her kindness. She said she was tired of it, tired of being trapped in an endless loop of seeking and never finding. She wanted to rest, but she couldn't until someone willingly took on her burden. What burden, exactly? The eternal repetition of her trauma. She's doomed to relive the worst night of her life over and over, but she's twisted it into something else. Instead of being the victim who dies alone and betrayed, she's become the one who brings that isolation and betrayal to others. You make it sound like she's doing it deliberately. I don't think she has a choice. Death trauma can do terrible things to the human soul, especially violent or emotionally devastating death. She's trapped in a pattern she can't break, compelled to repeat it every 7 years. Professor Vasquez spoke up. But you didn't disappear. You're still here. What made you different? I smiled sadly. Faith, perhaps. Or maybe just stubborn refusal to abandon my calling. When she asked me to take her place, I told her I couldn't. I had responsibilities to my parish, people who needed me. I offered to help her find peace in other ways. How did she react? She became ... angry. The temperature in the car dropped even further, and I could see my breath coming out in white clouds. She said I was just like all the others, promising help, but ultimately thinking only of myself. Then she simply vanished. One moment she was there, the next the passenger seat was empty and soaking wet. But you lived. I lived. But I've never forgotten that night, and I've been dreading the next time she would appear. Every 7 years, like clockwork, someone disappears on Highway 49. And every time, I wonder if I could have done something different. Detective Brooks pulled out a photograph of Marcus Holloway. This is our current missing person. Is there anything about the pattern that might help us find him? I studied the photograph, seeing a kind face, someone who looked like he'd stop to help a stranger without hesitation. He fits the profile. Young, traveling alone, the type of person who would offer assistance to someone in need. But detective, you need to understand something important. What? Those people aren't just missing. They're not hidden somewhere, waiting to be rescued. They've been absorbed into Victoria's manifestation. They've become part of her story, trapped in the same cycle of trauma and repetition that binds her. You're saying they're dead. I'm saying they're something worse than dead. They're caught between worlds, unable to rest, unable to move on. And every 7 years, when Victoria appears again, their agony continues. The room fell silent, except for the soft ticking of my grandfather clock. Outside, the evening wind rattled the windows of the old rectory, and I found myself wondering if Marcus Holloway was somewhere in that darkness, experiencing the kind of torment that no living person should have to endure. There is one possibility, I said finally. What? If someone were to encounter Victoria and successfully convince her to break the cycle, to choose forgiveness over vengeance, peace over repetition, it might be possible to free not just her, but all the souls she's taken. How would someone do that? By giving her what she's really looking for. Not a replacement, but understanding. Genuine compassion for her pain, without trying to escape the consequences of that compassion. You mean someone would have to willingly take her place? Not take her place. Join with her. Show her that she doesn't have to face eternity alone, that someone understands her betrayal and loss deeply enough to share it. But it would have to be someone with enough spiritual strength to transform that shared suffering into healing rather than perpetual torment. Detective Brooks looked skeptical. And you think that's possible? I think it's the only way to end this cycle. But I also think it would require someone willing to risk everything their life, their soul, their very existence, for the chance to save not just Victoria, but all the people she's taken. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times. It's resonant. Notes hanging in the air like a countdown. Outside, the wind was picking up, and I found myself wondering if somewhere in the darkness, Victoria Rain was preparing to appear again, drawn by the approach of her anniversary. "Detective," I said quietly, "if you're planning to investigate this further, be very careful. Victoria appears to those who might help her, but she's drawn to people with compassion, people who put others before themselves. That makes you a perfect target. Are you trying to scare me off the case?" "I'm trying to save your life, or at least your soul." The emergency call came through at 11:47 p.m., crackling over the radio with the kind of static that made you wonder if the storm was interfering with more than just the signal. "Unit 7, we have a possible vehicle accident on Highway 49, mile. Marker 37. Anonymous caller reported seeing headlights off the road. No response to attempts at contact." I was already reaching for the radio before my partner, Eddie Morales, could respond. We'd been working the night shift for 6 months, and Highway 49 was becoming familiar territory too familiar, considering how many accidents we'd responded to on that particular stretch of mountain road. "Unit 7 responding," Eddie said, firing up the ambulance and hitting the lights. ETA 12 minutes. As we wound through the mountain curves, I found myself thinking about the briefing we'd received that morning. Detective Brooks had visited the station, warning all emergency responders about a pattern of disappearances on Highway 49. Strange accidents, missing drivers, evidence that didn't make sense. She'd been particularly emphatic about not investigating. Alone and calling for backup immediately if we encountered anything unusual. "You remember what Brooks said about this road?" I asked Eddie as we approached mile marker 37. "About the missing people? Yeah, creepy stuff. But we've got a job to do, Jess. Someone might be hurt." The scene that greeted us was eerily familiar, even though I'd never been to this exact spot before. A sedan wrapped around a pine tree, front end completely demolished, driver's door hanging open. Steam rose from the radiator, and our headlights caught the glitter of shattered glass scattered across the asphalt. But there was no driver. "Same pattern," Eddie muttered, grabbing his medical kit. "Just like Brooks described." We approached the vehicle cautiously, our flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. The impact had been severe, but the passenger compartment was mostly intact. I leaned through the driver's side door, noting the deployed airbag and the fee. Blood on the headrest. "Driver survived the initial impact," I called to Eddie. "But where did they go?" That's when I noticed the passenger seat. It was soaked through, water dripping steadily onto the floor mat, despite the fact that it hadn't rained in over a week. The fabric was so saturated, it squelched when I pressed my hand against it, releasing more water than should have been physically possible. "Eddie, you need to see this." He joined me at the passenger side, whistling low when he saw the impossible dampness. What the hell could cause that? Before I could answer, we heard a voice calling from somewhere in the darkness. Beyond the tree line. Faint, feminine, definitely in distress. "Help me. Please, someone help me." Eddie and I exchanged glances. Every instinct told us to investigate, to find whoever was calling and render aid. But Detective Brooks' warnings echoed in my mind, along with the stories she'd shared about other responders who'd encountered something inexplicable on this road. "We should call for backup," I said. "Jess, someone's hurt out there. We can't just ignore it." The voice came again, closer this time. "Please, my car broke down. I've been walking for hours." Through the trees, I could see a pale figure moving toward us. Even in the dim light of our flashlights, details were becoming visible. Young woman, mid-20s, wearing what looked like a white dress. She moved with an odd, gliding gait that didn't quite match normal walking patterns. "Ma'am," Eddie called, "stay where you are. We're paramedics. We're here to help." She emerged from the tree line, and that's when my blood turned to ice water. She was beautiful in an otherworldly way, with sharp cheekbones and long dark hair that seemed to move independently of the wind. But it was her dress that made my stomach clench, an elaborate wedding gown, complete with intricate lacework, and a train that should have been torn and muddied from walking through the forest. Instead, it was pristine white and soaking wet, water dripping from the fabric with every step she took. "Thank you," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite the distance between us. "I didn't think anyone would come." Eddie started toward her, medical kit in hand, but I grabbed his arm. Something about her stillness, her perfect composure after supposedly walking for hours through rough terrain, triggered every warning bell. I possessed, "Eddie, wait. Jess, she needs medical attention. Look at her, she's soaked through, probably hypothermic." But as she got closer, I could see details that made rational explanation impossible. Her feet were bare, but there was no mud, no scratches, no indication she'd been walking through the forest. Her dress was drenched, but no water fell from it onto the dry leaves beneath her feet. And her eyes reflected our flashlight beams like an animal's, throwing back pale green fire that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her skull. "My car broke down about a mile back," she said, stepping into the full beam of our lights. "Could you help me get to town?" That's when I recognized her. Not personally. I'd never seen her before in my life. But I recognized her from the photograph Detective Brooks had shown us during the briefing. Victoria Rain, the woman who died in 1982, whose accident had supposedly triggered decades of disappearances on this stretch of road. "Eddie," I said quietly, "we need to leave, now." "What are you talking about?" "She needs help. She's been dead for 42 years. The woman Victoria tilted her head at my words, and her expression shifted from vulnerable to something harder, more calculating. "You know who I am." It wasn't a question. "You're Victoria Rain. You died on this road in 1982. She smiled. And the temperature around us dropped 20 degrees in an instant. Our breath began misting in the suddenly frigid air, and frost started forming on the windows of the damaged sedan. "Very good, Jessica. Yes, I know your name. I know many things about you. About your work, your compassion for strangers, your tendency to put others' needs before your own safety." Eddie was looking between us like we'd both lost our minds. "Jess, what's going on? Who is this woman?" "Eddie, get back to the ambulance. Call for backup. Do it now." But Victoria stepped sideways, somehow positioning herself between us and our vehicle without seeming to move quickly. "There's no need for backup, Jessica. I only need one of you." "For what?" "For what I've always needed. Someone to understand, someone to share the burden of eternal isolation and betrayal." The frost was spreading, coating the trees and undergrowth. Around us with crystalline ice. Eddie's teeth were chattering, and I could feel the cold seeping through my uniform, chilling me to the bone. "You take people," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Every 7 years, you appear to someone and they disappear. I take people who show me kindness, people who offer help to a stranger in distress, people like you, Jessica, who risk their lives every night to save others. What happens to them? They join me. They become part of my story, sharing the endless repetition of my worst night. They experience what I experienced: betrayal, abandonment, death alone and afraid." Eddie was backing toward the ambulance, finally understanding that this wasn't a normal medical call. But Victoria turned those reflecting eyes on him, and he froze mid-step like a deer caught in headlights. "You can leave, Edward," she said conversationally. "I have no interest in you. You're not the type I'm looking for." "What type are you looking for?" I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. "Someone like you. Someone who puts others first, who sacrifices for strangers, who understands what it means to be betrayed by those you trust." She stepped closer, and I could smell something like winter air and deep water on her skin. You remind me of myself, Jessica. Before I learned that kindness is weakness and trust is foolishness. I'm not going anywhere with you. No? What? About Marcus Holloway? He's been with me for 3 days now, experiencing what I experience every moment of every day. The cold, the loneliness, the endless repetition of trauma. Would you like to see him? The air shimmered beside her, and suddenly there was another figure standing in the darkness. Marcus Holloway, still wearing his work clothes, but his skin was pale blue, and his eyes held the same reflecting quality as Victoria's. When he spoke, his voice echoed with the sound of someone calling from the bottom of a well. "Help us," he said, the words seeming to come from everywhere at once. "Please help us. You see?" Victoria said, "He understands now." They all understand. Eventually. The futility of hope, the emptiness of human connection, the certainty that everyone you trust will ultimately abandon you. I looked at Marcus, at the plea in his reflecting eyes, and felt something break inside my chest. This was what Detective Brooks had been warning us about. This was the choice that had faced 7 other people over the past 35 years. What do you want from me? What I've always wanted. Someone to take my place. Someone to bear the burden of eternal repetition while I finally rest. And if I refuse, then Marcus continues to suffer. As do David and Robert and James and Kevin and Michael. They're all here, Jessica, trapped in my story, experiencing my pain over and over again. The air shimmered again, and suddenly I could see them 7 figures standing in the darkness behind Victoria, all with that same pale skin and reflecting eyes, all looking at me with desperate hope. But if I take your place, you'll free them? I'll be free to rest. And yes, they'll be released from their torment.